Well, hello, Mike Benoit here, Little Tyranny Busters on July 4th, 2014. Some folks call this Independence Day. I call it Independence Day. Instead of independence, independence. All right, so try to bust a little tyranny upon the mind of man, and tyranny upon the mind of man is first mind control. And if you've seen any other Tyranny Busters videos, you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about mind control or tyranny upon the mind of man. It's controlling somebody's mind without their knowing it. So that's tyranny upon the mind of man. Now let's just imagine, for example, if you were under the, well, I'm going to call it illusion at this point. Let's say you're under the conception that you were free and that you were living in the freest country in the world. And I would go, okay, let's take a look at that. Now, what is the definition of freedom? And then in turn, what's the definition of slavery? Of course, can you imagine if someone was a slave and actually thought he was free? That would be sort of like, there must be some kind of tyranny going on upon his mind that make him believe that he was free. So, what is the concept of free, or living free, or being independent? If you go back to 1776, I think you see a society where people were neither indentured to government or dependent on government. Now, also you go back to 1776, and you'll find that there were some government abuses, and people had good reason to complain against those government abuses. But were they living in a condition where their livelihood, the fruits of their labor, were owned by government? I don't think so. Or they were dependent on government to just exist? I don't think so there either. But come fast forward to 2014, and the question this year would be, who out there is living free and independent? Who out there is not indentured to government, where the fruits of their labor are basically determined as to how much they get to keep of those fruits of their labor by government? Or you're on the other side of the coin, you're dependent on the government redistribution of someone else's property, their labor or their capital. So you're in that condition of dependency. But if you're not indentured to a federal tax income system, and you're not, or a state income tax system, and you're not dependent on a government check for your existence, then I would say you're free and independent. And please notify me at mblibertarian7@earthlink.net, because I'm looking for free and independent people. Now we get this other idea that, and then people want to go celebrate Independence Day. Boy, we got this independence from Great Britain. And at that period of time, I guess a lot of folks thought Great Britain was pretty, or England, was pretty suppressive. But, you know, there were a lot of other folks that didn't think so. Understand that there were about 100,000 what were considered loyalists to the crown who left the new United States of America, who left and went to Canada. Now that's a pretty large number of people to actually leave their homes, and at that point in time compared to the whole population. Not everybody was displeased. Sometimes you might wonder, would we even have more freedom now if we hadn't had that revolution? I don't know. But of course, the concept of the Declaration of Independence were that we were free and independent people, and we had these inalienable rights. And of course, there wasn't this concept that the government had this right to to take the fruits of one person's labor and give it to someone else for their life. It wasn't the concept that because we were endowed with these rights to life, liberty, and property that we're also endowed with the right to impose the obligation to sustain those rights onto somebody else. For that would create a condition of dependence and indentured servitude. So that's the opposite of independence. So anyway, there's quite a contrast between then and now. And now we look around and if you think about it, and people kind of only bounce across. It's almost like if you were a slave on the foundation and on the plantation. And so you're this slave on the plantation, and you have certain duties or obligations that you have to accomplish, and you know what they are, and you go about them every day, and then the rest of the time is yours to try to get some other enjoyment out of life and whatnot. And in the evenings you get to sit there and socialize with your friends and families, but you're still a slave on the plantation. Now, and I know a lot of people, and I'm sure it happened back then too, they would compare life on one plantation with another, and when people complained about their condition of slavery, they turn around and say, yeah, but look at over there on Master Jefferson's plantation. Those folks are all doing pretty good. Look at us here on Master Wilson's plantation. We get beat, and we don't get as good food to eat, and we're not allowed to stay with, get married or stay with our partner. We get separated from our partner and all that stuff. But on Jefferson's plantation, they were about as happy over there. So people on Jefferson's plantation are talking about how good they have it versus the other ones and how bad they have it. Yet they're still in bondage, human bondage. And of course, you come now and we'll say, well, people say, well, we're not in human bondage now. We can do whatever we want. We're free to do whatever we want. And so then I, ask the question, well, can you just go in your car, the car that you bought with your money, your other property, and you bought this other property, and can you get in that property and go from here to the next city without getting permission from the state? You say, oh, yeah, I can do that. I said, well, but you have a license, don't you? And you reply, yeah, I got a license. Well, what's the license for? Oh, so I can drive. So in other words, without the license, you couldn't drive. Without the permission, you couldn't drive. Oh, well, yeah, we got to make sure people know what they're doing, that they know how to drive. Because if they don't know how to drive, then we won't be safe. Oh, okay. So that's something you think we should do. But the bottom line is, you're living by permission. You're not living by freedom. Or if it comes to, let's say, you got this property that you bought. Now they got a property tax on it, and the property tax is every year. It's automatic, no matter what. Now, if you don't pay that property tax, what's going to happen to your property? Well, they're going to take your property away from you, aren't they? And they're going to sell it at auction, aren't they? And you go, yeah, but I'm supposed to pay my property tax, because that's for police and for schools, and it's for this, that, and the other thing. And so, but the question is, if you own that property, then how can somebody put an obligation on your property that if you don't pay, then they're going to take your property away? And especially when this is passed, let's say this legislation was passed 30 years ago, and maybe 15 years before you even got your property. You're going, so the question is, though, you may sit there and justify in your mind and help the tyranny upon your mind and say, yeah, well, we have to pay that tax. But the greater question is, then, do you truly own your property, or are you just renting it? And if you don't pay the full rent payment, then you're evicted from the property. Or if you take a look at the property and you say, I want to put a little addition on it. So are you able to just hire yourself an architect, an engineer, and go about and buy the building materials and hire some help to do it, and just go out there and build your addition. You say, oh, no, I got to go to the county and get a permit, and they got to do inspections and everything like that. And so what's the idea? The idea is, well, it's for safety, for everybody's safety. You have to do this. And if I constructed something that was ugly, the other people's property values would go down. All right, well, that's not the question then. The question is, do you truly own your property? And if you own your property, don't you get to remodel it as you see fit? And so, but people today have accepted this idea that, or this tyranny upon their mind, that they own their property, and that in the process of owning their property, they have to get permits to do anything with it. So they're actually living there in the condition of by permission. And so, or take a look around. Let's take a look at the income tax, or the so-called income tax. And so most Americans, whether it be in the 150 million that are paying income tax or the 150 million that aren't, think, okay, yep, this is the freest country in the world. Okay, and so just take the super rich guy who is also paying income tax. So this super rich guy has his labor. Question is, does he own his labor, or does the state own his labor? Now, if the state can come in and say, well, we're going to take 20% of the fruits of your labor, then does he own his labor, or does the state own his labor? Well, to me, it sounds like the state owns his labor. But he's going, well, you know what? That's no big deal. Heck, I'm making $50 million a year, and actually, the bracket that the state wants from him is, 40%, 50%, depends on what state he's in. And he's going, well, that's no big deal. I got to keep 25 million. And so in that sense, he's got a lot of purchasing power with the 25 million. But is that any different than he's still on the plantation and he's doing what the master says? Yeah, and the master puts him at the highest rung of the ladder there, puts him at the top and says, you're like one of the top overseers here. You employ 10,000 people under you. So you're number one top dog here, and you're free. But if you don't give me half of the fruits of your labor, I'm going to put you in prison. But otherwise, you're free. So we consider that condition as a condition of freedom. Now, I know a lot of folks are going to say, well, where does the government get its money if it doesn't do that? Well, you weren't alive, I guess, before when they got plenty of money without enslaving every individual. But now let's take the guy right below that guy. Let's say that's a big CEO of a big corporation. Now you got a guy right below him, and maybe he's a vice president of some department. So he's in the same stream there, same game. And in fact, when he got hired, he went in and said, well, let's work out a contract here, and this is how much I'm going to get paid, and this is how much you're going to pay me, and this is how much work I'm going to do. And top dog and him, they came to agreement, and there they go. And so, but then he goes, top dog says to him, yeah, we got to sign this form here. This is for withholding taxes from our contract. Those taxes that the government wants from you. So here's number 2 overseer. He's not number 1 overseer, because number 1 overseer is maybe the CEO, or maybe the enforcement arm of the agents at the Internal Revenue Service. Maybe they're the number 1 seer. But we want to think, because these guys have a lot of permission, they got a lot of slack, they can do a lot on the plantation. Relatively speaking, compared to others, they're going to say, well, I'm free. Yeah, I'm free. I look at this money. I can go on a yacht. I can do this. I can do that. But if I don't give the master what he wants, kind of like the little drug gangs, or with the mafiosa, you got all the people down the line collecting the mordita. The mordita, I guess that's bribes. I don't know if that's the right term to use. But, payoffs, the payoffs. And so we got a sophisticated system with the government doing it. Now, I'm not saying that these people don't in comparison to a lot of other people, have a good standard of living. But that's just like comparing one slave from another slave on the plantation. And then you come all the way down the ladder here. Now, the guys at the top, they don't mind this so much because they can get out there and have their yachts, and they can have their Mercedes and all these different kinds of luxuries, 2, 3, 4, 5 houses, whatever that might be. And so they don't mind this slavery so much. And they also don't mind it because the cost of the taxes that they pay, they can pass that down the line. I imagine back in 1913, the reason the income tax was able to get passed in the first place, or the amendment, so-called amendment for the 16th Amendment for income tax, was that it was only going to, a small percentage of the population, just a few people, going to have to pay for this. And so all the rest of us saying, hey, that's okay, it's soak the rich, they got so much money, they need to pay their fair share. Make them pay. And the rich are going, hey, no big whoopee, I don't care. And so we're all equally guilty, and I say we all, or people around at that time, because they couldn't recognize the beginning of an institution of slavery rooting itself at that point in time. So because it only affected a few people, the super rich, and guys like Henry Ford, I can imagine Henry Ford sitting there at dinner time, and he was saying to himself, well, they passed this 16th Amendment, they want this much income taxes from me every year. And let's see, I'm netting myself about $28 million a year. I want to keep $20 million a year, or maybe I want $25 million a year, I don't know. We sold this many Fords last year, so how many Fords for this new taxes that's going to take so much from me do I have to sell, and at what price to get my net $20 million that I want? Well, so he figures that out, and he maybe grosses $25 million, and the tax rates actually were very low, so this is not a good example back then. But and pays his taxes, and he ends up with $20 million. He raised the price of the Ford $30, so everybody down on the end of the food chain there had to pay more for the Ford, and Henry Ford didn't really pay this new so-called income tax. It's one of those real weird things where, we're going to get the whip out and whip somebody else, and it backlashes and whips us. And of course, maybe people saving for the Ford or whatnot, they didn't even tie the two things together. So, and then you go further down the chain there, and the tax tyrants start bringing more people into this condition of bondage under the so-called income tax laws. And if you look back, actually go all the way up to 1935, the so-called income tax was in effect for 20 years for the super rich. But in 1935, most people that were working for, that's laboring for their existence, or in the skilled trades or unskilled trades or whatnot, they weren't paying any income taxes. And they, at the end of the week, whether they got paid weekly or monthly or whatever they got paid, they typically would get a pay envelope. I guess maybe some folks would get paychecks, but there they go. They agreed to work for, say it was $35 a week. They went, and at the end of the week they got their $35. Well, in 1935, there's this little payroll deduction scheme that starts with the Social Security. So this is the opportunity for the government to reach into a paycheck or a pay envelope or whatever, and get the businesses to start being a tax collector for them. That's more indentured servitude, a tax collector for the government. And the scheme of the 1935 Social Security, it was sold to the American public on the basis of, look, if your contribution is 50 cents, the employer has to match that, so that's 50 cents. So you've got a gain already, an instant gain of 50 cents. Now this is going to be put away into a trust fund for you, so that when you're old you have this money and you'll get a monthly check all the time. So those things all sounded good. When you're old, you're going to be taken care of. So again, it's part of the process of giving up some freedom for some pretense of security. But in the process, employers, government again jumps in and forces employers and violates the contract that employers and employees made, and basically the idea that all contracts should be, violatable, that you can't violate a contract, was negated, and that the government can do it whenever it basically passed a law or legislation to do that. So they get in and they start taking money out of the worker's paycheck. All right, and in the meantime, and maybe you're getting a little inflation, and the United States Congress is seeing a need for money and coming into a war, and so they lower the place at the point in time where they're going to start charging people tax on income, and actually the idea that your labor is some sort of gain, that what you get paid for your labor is some sort of gain, is just a ludicrous idea. It's a tyranny upon the mind. It's a slavery of the mind. Because if you had, for example, a pile of raw material that had a certain value to it, that you purchased it and had that certain value, and you sold it, what you sold it for is not income or gain. And if your labor has a certain value, what you sell it for is not income or gain either. So it's just a fair exchange. But convince the people with a tyranny upon their mind that the government's only taxing income, and we kind of just shake our heads like that. Yeah, they're taxing income. What's wrong with that? And they're not taking very much. And so this slavery just kind of pushes in there just a little bit there. And, got to have some money for the war effort and whatnot, do your patriotic duty. Well, it's later on when this condition of slavery gets kicked into a higher gear, and that's when they start taking the so-called income tax right out of your paycheck. Now you can see how logic would work if let's say there was a tax and it's legal and it was upon your income and how much money you made at the end of the year, then the tax would be assessable at that point in time and on the total amount of money that you earned. Well, most people would have spent all of that in their existence. So for the government to not have everybody in default, they have to have a tax rate that's low enough so that they'd be able to collect it. Well, so that kind of limits the amount of resources they get. But if they start up something like, convincing people that payroll deduction of the so-called income tax, then it would be easier for people to pay, and they buy that concept. But then the government's able to ratchet up how much they're taking, especially if they, make credit easy for people. And when I say that, it's like if you've got some money in your pocket and you got a tax bill due, and you also have to put a new engine in your car, you're going to put a new engine in your car. But if you got easy credit, you got a tax bill due, and you're afraid what the government will do to you, then you'll pay the government and then use your credit card to get your the engine put in your car. And so you get both things done there at that time. But once the government was able to get into the paycheck, then it could ratchet up how much it's going to take. Let's say somebody made $20,000 a year, and the government at the end of the year wanted the 10% or 20% of that or whatever, and said, okay, you owe us $4,000. Well, most people wouldn't have it. But if government came in and said, well, we're taking $40 a week, well, then they have it. They're taking it right out of that paycheck, and people are going to continue to work and have to pay. So they're going to get, they're going to further get indentured into this system of indentured servitude to the government. Now, what happens, and the government's taking more and more of this pool of money, and it turns around and looks around and says, oh, look at these people over there. They can't make it very well. And they probably can't make it very well because government's taking so much of the of people's production and labor that those people don't have an opportunity to make it. So the government swoops down and says, okay, well, here you go. We're going to help you out. You got Johnson's Great Society programs of the 60s. So the welfare and all of that. So here you go. We'll help you out. Poor little you. I'm the government. I'm here to help you. Here you go. Consequently, so we create a group of people who are now dependent on the government. And so they're part of the plantation system as well. They're the dependent slaves. And of course, the government continue to be master in a very free society instead of servant, it has to take the production of some of the citizens, and give it to the other citizens, because if it doesn't do that, then it's not master, it's going to be servant, and just do the legitimate functions. But it sets itself up to do more than that. So we come down the pike, and we get way down the pike like we are now, and there you go. You've got half the population dependent on the government, and the other half indentured to the government. But the system is so insidious that the people at the top half of the indentured pyramid really don't see that they're indentured, and that's because their standard of living is way up there, and they actually get the benefit of passing the cost of their tax burden or slave burden onto the slaves that are in the lower castes. And so then that's passed, and it's passed to a certain point, and then it's almost like once you get past that point, then it's no longer burden being passed, but it's dependency being passed too. So where's the actual burden of the taxation being made at? Well, it's there in the middle, the middle class, the guys, the people that are actually producing. And so as the society keeps going further and further down the hole, and you get less and less producers, more and more dependents, less and less of the indentured servants, because they can't make it. They're broken into being dependents. Then you can see the inevitable results. But it's freedom and independence that led prosperity and abundance. It's not this other indentured servitude and dependence that lead to the abundance, and that are part of a condition of freedom. So this pretense of security by the government and the Social Security, because actually we stopped that in the middle on the Social Security thing. So what actually happened was, now let's say if it was a system, and take the force of forcing your employer out of the game, but people were just given the opportunity to invest a little bit of their paycheck to be invested for their retirement years, and they put it away in some investment of say real capital, gold, silver, mining stocks, owning of corporations and whatnot, where it's a real asset that is just going to be sold later, and so that they can live off their saved capital. It's totally different than a Social Security fraud Ponzi scheme where people were lied to, and they were told that the monies were going to go into a trust account. Well, there never was a trust account. The monies went into the general account of the Treasury, and then from there they were spent. So no trust account. So it's a generational redistribution of labor, of production. The trust account was non-existent until somewhere, I think it was 60s and 70s, somewhere they created a scheme to make it look like there was a trust account. But there never was one, and for it to be constitutional, there couldn't be one. They had to be taxes as part of the taxing power of Congress, and then expenditures as part of the expenditure powers of Congress. So all that money that people thought they were putting away was being spent on any myriad number of government programs. So from there, then you come, fast forward a little bit into the 60s. Because there was nothing they could point to say this is a trust account, people starting to wake up. Hey, where's all the money? It's all gone and spent. Then they started a scheme where the government would, what they do is they would save up. They wouldn't save up. What they would do is look at what they needed to appropriate in funds for Social Security payouts for the year, and they would take what came in Social Security taxes. They would actually take that, and they would appropriate the amount of taxes that came in for expenditures for the Social Security. They would even though they didn't need to spend that much, they would appropriate that much instead of just appropriating what they needed to spend. And then they would turn around and loan that balance back to the government. So they would appropriate out of the general account X amount of money. They spent one half of X on benefits that were due, and so they were left with one half X, and they said, we'll loan this back to the government, and that will be our trust account. So it's like one pocket owes another pocket money, but neither pocket has any money in it, and we're going to call that a trust account. So anyway, we moved that forward, and we're coming to the point where we are now, and all the monies on the Social Security, they don't have the ability to do that. In other words, what they're getting in Social Security taxes or revenue is less than what they have to pay out. So that scheme is drying up, and this IOU trust fund is not going to be looking too good coming up in the future. But the bottom line is, what we created with that is more of that plantation mentality. We have a huge section of the population that's dependent on the government, and another section that's indentured to the government. So you got socialism dividing the families generationally. You got, say, senior citizens that are living off the labor of their children and grandchildren, and nobody knows it, or people don't realize it. That's the way it is. And of course, they're thinking, a lot of people are thinking, well, I'm paying Social Security and it's just a social contract. Now they're starting to get people to change the idea. It's just a social contract. We have obligations to the seniors to take care of them as a social contract, and our children will have the obligation to take care of us. But that's still creating a condition of dependency if that's what you want instead of independency. The idea of starting Social Security in the beginning is that you'd have some money so you wouldn't be dependent. So you wouldn't be derelict and dependent. And look at, we got the opposite. But worse than all of that is this system, a plantation system of living by permission and indentured servitude. It's going to come apart because there's not going to be enough people or enough production to be taken away from those that are producing to give those that are not producing. And again, the incentive is to become one of the non-producers instead of a producer, removing the incentive away from producing and changing it over to non-producing. So this is your Independence Day, and people will go out there and they're going to celebrate and barbecue and enjoy their steaks and their beers, and it's good. We should enjoy these things while we have them, absolutely, but not under the false pretense that we have independence, that we're a free nation and a free people. And so where does this all end, though? Because even now, with our banking institutions extremely fragile, the whole economy extremely fragile, things possibly breaking down. That's a phone call, but I'm not going to answer it. So I'm going to hit that. It still seems like it's okay. It's almost like before the tsunami hits, things are okay. Before the dam breaks, things are okay. Okay, the big question is the dam going to break? Well, of course it's going to break. Is the tsunami going to hit? Of course it's going to hit. It's a matter of logical deduction. You can take a look at things on a logical basis. Now, let's talk about some more things, because since people think that we're living in a situation of independence, how about those people who decide, well, you know what, I want to use marijuana, and I want to use peyote, and I want to use LSD. If you're free and independent people, I think you should use that. I'm not saying it's a very smart thing to do or a logical thing to do, but I also don't think it's a very smart thing or logical thing to do or a freedom thing to do, to lock these people up and to make other people who don't use that stuff pay for locking them up. So not only are you violating a lot of people's rights, uh, you're causing a scenario where uh, everybody has less money. So, but that's how we got that as a system. What we have right now, we have millions of people locked up for, say, drug offenses, that kind of a thing. And we, at the same time, consider this a free country. We have somebody that gets arrested in Mexico over some gun violations, and we're up in arms about it. But then we got tens of thousands of people in American prisons for some BS gun violation, and we don't say anything about it. So that's the tyranny upon the mind of man to think that we are free, and we want to protest somebody who is in prison, one of ours that are in prison in another country, as if, everything's hunky-dory in this country. Now, when it isn't, and I don't know, they talk about we got more people in prison in America per capita than any other civilized country in the world, and yet we call that freedom. I mean, how many other places do we go with this? In the healthcare scenario, you're forced to buy healthcare insurance, and in the healthcare insurance, how many rules and regulations and demands by all levels of government have come into the healthcare industry, if you will, and messed that up? How many of us have increased medical needs because we're either in a dependent class and we're sitting around loafing and degenerating and degrading and turning into physical blobs that need a lot of health care, or the other ones that have our backs and knees broken from the arduous labor of supplying and providing for all of that. And then we're sitting around and government's promising us more medical choices for less, and their involvement in all of this stuff from A to Z has made us need more medical care, and the rules and regulations in the medical care industry have created a scenario where it takes more and more of our money to pay for such a thing. The insanity just goes on and on and on, and the answer to the problem is the restoration of liberty. The cause of the problem is the destruction of liberty. If you take a look at every law the government, the federal government, state government, made up about medical care, and remove that, all those laws, and then ask yourself at that point in time, how much is the health care going to cost you? When the government, before there were laws that said that you show up to a hospital, that they have to treat you no matter what, they would always treat you. But you also knew that you had an obligation, and they would say, well, you're Mr. Jones, and I realize you don't have the money now, but you're going to have to make payments on this. And you understand that? Mr. Jones goes, yes, I understand that. Fix my broken arm, please. I'll make the payments. And he would. Now, the federal government says, oh, you know what? Somebody didn't get treated once. So they say, you know what? We'll make a federal law. Never mind, there's no constitutional authority for such a thing. And they'll say, oh, we'll make a federal law, and in this federal law, if somebody shows up to a hospital must treat them, no matter what. And of course, nobody was going to stand around and say, well, you're going to make the hospital treat these people, and they're not going to get reimbursed. You have to do something to reimburse the hospital. So then they'd write legislation to get the hospital reimbursed. So what did you do right there? Just told everybody, and you just made the cost of health care go up, because you just told everybody that they could go to the hospital, get treated no matter what. You just told the providers that they're going to get paid no matter what, and so they don't care. Nobody cares about price anymore, do they? Because it's going to be passed on. All right, and so that's just like one of the beginning points. But earlier than that, they even limited the number of doctors that could go to medical school. Restriction of freedom. And you look at every law, and they call them laws, but they're really perversions of law, because they violate Frederick Bastiat's definition of law. And law is that which secures our right to life, liberty, and property, not that which violates our right to life, liberty, and property. So if they make a law that says the hospital has to treat Mr. Jones when he shows up, when the hospital is going to do it anyway because they certainly they're in the business because they sure they want to make a good living, but they're in the business because they want to help humanity, and they certainly don't want a bad reputation in the community for not helping some poor guy out and working with them and letting them make payments. But no, the government will jump in between that, restricting your liberty, your right to choose, and restricting responsibility as well. And then we wonder why we end up in a society that's not free and it's not responsible. And this stuff can go on and on and on, but it has the basic root, the same basic root for all of this stuff. And then the simplicity of the whole matter is, are we living in a society where we're free and independent, or are we living in a society where we're ruled, regulated, and controlled, indentured, and or dependent? Now, it's pretty obvious. Uh, and even that one, as long as you get food and circus, even on the negative one, food and entertainment, you think it's okay. But the problem is on the negative one that it's going to lead to a point where you don't even have your food and circus. When you give up your freedom for false security, you're going to end up with neither. And so we're going to be in the big time soup. And it's wrong to impose conditions of servitude on some and dependency on and create dependency on others. And the reason we've got this, nobody's fault but each of us individually. So this is my July 4th Independence Day rant. I usually don't like to engage in a long soliloquy, and this is going to be almost 45 minutes. I like the back and forth, but we don't have anybody here to do back and forth. Hopefully some folks will listen to this and say, hey Mike, well, how do we start working on being free? Thanks for joining me today. Enjoy the rest of the day.